Thank you. So I want to share some notions about the power of great questions with us this afternoon. In a way, great questions can change our world, can change our way of seeing things. We often call them softball questions. The quality of a good softball question is that you are the only person on the face of the earth who can answer it. And it doesn't have a hint of judgment or advice. So, for example, this one might be, what's something we would not find on your resume that has shaped your life, has shaped who you are? That's a good softball question. So I want to talk about some examples of those in my own life and their lessons. One came from a total stranger. I was headed into interviews for a very competitive fellowship program. There were 2,500 applicants and only 15 slots, and I was really relaxed because I knew I was not going to get selected. So I was feeling very good about this, very relaxed, and then I found myself face to face with a weekend of interviews. I was in the last 30 of this gang, and my phone rang, and the man on the other end of the phone said, "I see you're on the list of those going into the final interviews." He said, "I'm at the Pentagon, and you don't know me, but I just called to ask how I could help. A few years back," he said, "the Army nominated me for this program, and so I went through that interview process alone, not knowing what to expect, with no one to talk with, and he said it was really hard for me. It was uncomfortable. I wouldn't want you to have to go through it alone. So here's my phone number, and I want you to call if talking might be helpful. Now, your experience will be different than mine," he said, "but I'm here to help in any way I can." So at his instruction, I wrote down the phone number. It was 703, it was the Pentagon, and his name, Powell. I was so struck, only later would he be Secretary of State and head of the Joint Chiefs, but he never tried to give me advice, and he never even told me he'd been selected. He just kept asking how he could help. Sometimes the question that changes our life is one we ask ourselves. At one point, I was stuck in a job that was not going well, and the question that changed things was one I asked myself. My head was completely filled with this miserable work situation, and out of the blue, in my journal, I wrote on a sheet of paper, "Who draws your best energy, your best effort?" And I thought, where did that come from? But I listed a whole bunch of names, people I could think of off the top of my head, in whose presence I was my very best, and I folded the paper up, and I tucked it in the journal, and months later, it fell out on the floor. And I didn't even know what it was. I picked it up, and I opened it, and I realized I was somehow in touch with all 22 people on that list. My life had completely changed. The question about who draws my best energy had shifted my attention away from my woes and toward my resources. Sometimes we ask a question because we're new. Many of us have experienced this, and the situation is totally unexpected and we don't know what to do, and we think somebody else probably knows. I was flying internationally as a Pan American flight attendant to put myself through college. I had 6 weeks experience, and leaving out of London, headed for JFK, a half an hour into the flight, the captain announced very calmly that we had lost power in one of our 4 engines, and so we'd be going back to London. And then he added, but since we were too heavy to land, we'd first be dumping fuel over the Atlantic for an hour. So I sidled up to the lead flight attendant and asked gently, "What's your experience with this sort of situation?" Her response was not helpful. She said, "I've been flying for 20 years and this is my first time." So this was what Ron Heifetz would call unexpected territory for all of us, leadership without easy answers. Václav Havel once said that leadership in uncertain situations requires being a non-anxious presence. So I learned how to be a non-anxious presence, pouring coffee and passing out drinks for that hour over the Atlantic. And then I learned it further from the captain who, as we headed back to Heathrow, began telling the passengers about the sights on either side of the plane as he headed into the runway, lined by all the emergency equipment, and landed it safely. And sometimes, this is my fourth example of questions, sometimes asking a simple question because we're puzzled uncovers a complex problem that needs serious attention. I was new to a job. It was the one I ended up in because of that fellowship program, and I was given a stack of files about this high with a note on the top that said, "The Postmaster General owes us $15 million. Get him to pay it." I was completely new and inexperienced, so the first question that came to mind, and sometimes that's a good question, as I looked at the simple invoice in front of me, it said due to the Department of Labor $15 million, was, where's the detail to the bill? Then there was a long pause, and somebody said, we don't have the detail. And then there was a long pause, and I said, how long will it take to get it? And the answer was, we can't provide it. Our IT system doesn't have the capacity to produce it. Now that was a more important problem to address than the missing $15 million. So I go back to Ron Heifetz's words from Harvard, which is sometimes you can lead with only a question in hand. And sometimes the question comes out of curiosity, like trying to figure something out. So I want to end with a poem. And actually, I noticed as I picked up the gift card, the appreciation cards, this poem is in that packet. What a gift. And it's about how to build a fire in a fireplace. I was a little nervous about this, realizing what California was dealing with. But this poem is called Fire. And it's about creating enough space to ask the questions that are this rich and then to listen for the answers. Fire. What makes a fire burn is space between the logs, a breathing space. Too much of a good thing, too many logs packed in too tight can douse the flames almost as surely as a pail of water would. So building fires, creativity, other kinds of possibilities, so building fires requires attention to the spaces in between as much as to the wood. When we are able to build open spaces in the same way we have learned to pile on the logs, then we can come to see how it is fuel and absence of the fuel together that make fire possible. We only need to lay a log lightly from time to time. A fire grows, our creativity. A fire grows simply because the space is there, with openings in which the flame that knows just how it wants to burn can find its way. Thank you.